Welcome back to another episode of World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Dmitry Kolyagin, alongside GSP from the War Report. Joining us today, unfortunately, Conrad couldn't make it to this particular episode of World War Now, but there is a lot of major and very big, important news to discuss, especially in regards to international relations, some visits by President Putin, the unfortunate passing of the president of Iran, as well as his Minister of International Affairs, as well as Russian domestic affairs. So I think GSP will just begin this episode and break it down with the massive changes to the Iranian political front. I think this is probably the biggest story of the last
Yeah.
fortnight because ever since that missile exchange between Iran and Israel, all eyes were on that particular area in the Middle East. And the recent visit
Mhm.
by President Raisi, as well as his Minister of Foreign Affairs, to Azerbaijan to discuss some important international relations issues with Aliyev, his return back to Iran was actually even more tragic. So the helicopter he was flying on, an American helicopter, crashed into the mountainside in northeastern Iran, and this was completely unexpected. There were a lot of theories around exactly how the helicopter crashed, how the Iranian security forces could have even allowed such an accident to take place, but it has been confirmed the helicopter has crashed. The Iranian officials have passed away, and Iran is in this period of mourning. Again, there are a lot of conspiracies and there are a lot of theories which have at this point been unconfirmed. It's almost very convenient. The beneficiaries here clearly Israel and the United States. And I'm not just saying this because I'm a big conspiracy theorist, but I think it's worth considering the fact that Raisi, as well as his foreign minister, have pushed the BRICS agenda and have made Iran more inclusive to this idea of multipolarity. And they've actually moved Iran onto the world scene, improved the relations with China, with Russia, sold those masses of Shahed drones to the Russian military industrial complex. Their
Yeah.
relationship has been building and improving. So I just want your thoughts about this particular tragedy for the Iranian people and exactly how it may play into the future of not just Iran, but also the entire Middle East, because Iran is this major, I would say, almost imperial player on that scene.
First of all, Raisi was president only from 2021 onwards. He replaced Rouhani. Rouhani was not as successful. The economy suffered under him. He was responsible for the deal, remember, with the Obama administration. But it was the current Ayatollah who chose him. The Ayatollah can choose sometimes conservative or other times liberal clerics. Raisi is very interesting because he changed his name. I believe his previous last name used to be Fadeh, and I think that means something like king in Persian, but it was a derivative of the Persian word for king, and he changed it to Raisi, which means cleric. So he's really signaling what he wants to do, and he was a conservative cleric. And as you mentioned, not only did he improve the economy, but he saw the direction Iran had to go in order to improve the economy in Iran. Of course, that put it on a footing, not a military footing, but on a footing, I would say, that's sovereign and is predicated on ideas about multipolarity. There's no question about that. But if he had remained in the same position as his predecessor, then Iran would just have floundered, which would have suited the US and the Israelis just as well. Now, about the crash, of course, there were all kinds of things that were said when that crash happened. You had fake stories. Some of them originated with the Iranian government saying that the pilot or the co pilot reached out and they're trying to find the signal. As it turns out, like the most recent stories that have not been changed or debunked or contradicted since are that at the last moment, his entourage switched helicopters, and it chose one without a transponder. So it cannot give a signal. And why they did that, I don't know. The other is, and you brought this up in an earlier conversation we had, and why was the foreign minister in the same helicopter as Raisi when clearly it would have been better if he had not been? There were three helicopters altogether. The other development is we have the testimony of, I believe, one of the pilots in one of the other helicopters. If people saw the footage, and on the war report, we dealt with this, the fog is absolutely horrible. It's horrible. However, this testimony, basically what he was saying was, yes, it was very foggy in the valleys, in the low ground, but generally they were flying above the fog, except for the last mountain, which was foggy at the top. That's his testimony, right? Now, the conspiracy theories are interesting, right? Israel did it, then the US did it, or the Azerbaijanis did it. It's very possible. I think it's more probable none of them did it. There is, of course, the possibility that for whatever reason, the Ayatollah could have had this guy killed. And the reason for that is the Ayatollah see, Raisi was scheduled basically to become part of the experts council. And the experts council is voted upon by the public, but they also decide on who the Ayatollah is. And for a lot of people, they thought Raisi would easily become part of the council and eventually he would become the Ayatollah, right? He it seems like a man that was determined for this position. That's why I brought up the changing of his name. The other is you have the son of the current Ayatollah, and there's speculation that he's being groomed to replace his father. But that could cause a rift, right? A rift between like moderate Iranians and more clerical and religious Iranians. Now, one of the reasons that Ayatollah might be emboldened to do this is if you go up to 2002, I don't know, 2011 or 12 or 13, in Iran, the people who thought that they could reform the system by voting essentially gave up. And Raisi won. A lot of that is because liberal Iranians or reformist Iranians have given up on voting altogether. They don't vote. And they don't vote because they think there's no chance that they'll ever get the kind of system that they want. And they're probably right. There were videos the next day during the funeral where the grandchildren of Raisi are embracing the Ayatollah. And it's, if you think this man might have been responsible for the death of their grandfather, it would be very dark, very weird. But that is something that people have talked about because the president of Iran is not like the president of the US or Russia, but his powers are much more limited. Geopolitical decisions, wars, all that kind of thing are not left to him. And then there's also the curious case of the day that the helicopter disappeared because apparently there was no transponder, and we don't know why they moved into this other helicopter at the last moment. This is according, again, as I said, to the latest testimonies. The Ayatollah apparently said, someone sent me a video, and what he's basically saying is, we're looking for them. God willing, we'll find them alive. But if not, everything's in order. We're going to be fine. A lot of people felt that even for Iran, even for the Ayatollah, that came too soon. You haven't even located the crash. And a lot of people were still under the belief that they'd already made contact to some degree. There was a hard landing. And we know now that was all false.
Look, the fact that the foreign minister, as you said, was also on that helicopter in that same cabin was major oversight, negligence. I'm not sure who came up with the protocol. I think the Iranian officials most likely will need to look into that, how that took place, and also who conducted the audit of the helicopter itself. Because again, this American helicopter is quite old. I believe it's 40, over 40 years of age,
45,
45 years. Like,
47 years.
and President Putin himself, of course, after passing on a message of mourning, he did say the two accompanying helicopters were in fact of a Russian Soviet made. Perhaps the president of Iran should have been traveling in one of the Russian helicopters, not an American one. And
Mhm.
again, who carries out maintenance on some of these American helicopters? Lockheed Martin or some of these warmongering officials, or can Iran itself maintain some of these American design helicopters? So many questions.
Sorry to interrupt, but Iran the next day blamed the US for the sanctions that they couldn't get the right parts. Of course, that's just baloney, right? They can
Yeah,
get the
yeah,
parts
that's
through the
right.
black market, but it's interesting that they made that statement.
Yeah, and the fact that he was labeled a martyr off the bat, and the question would
Mhm.
arise, perhaps in Islam, martyrdom is seen as something a little bit different to Christianity. Again, I don't want to get into the specifics of Shia belief, but it is quite curious if he did die in an accident, what exactly qualifies the president to be a martyr. But again, the death of the foreign minister and the president, especially now that they've set Iran on this major path towards being a fully fledged member of the multipolar society and BRICS and this sort of restructuring of the post dollar, you can say, maybe even post fiat economies, moving the world into a new stage. I think they had a clear vision for Iran, and hopefully, like Steve Jobs had a certain vision for Apple, right? And that vision, the Apple stuck with it for a few years. Hopefully, Iran goes along with what Raisi and Amir Abdullahian have actually set out for the country. Because again, there's that concern of Iran is the major player, is the major ally of China and Russia in the region. And if it somehow falls under American or let alone Israeli influence, right, which is hard to imagine again, but who knows?
Mhm.
We've seen even more staggering things take place, like in Egypt or in Jordan, some of these very Islamic countries, where some of the countries of the Hejaz and Arabia, being despite being very Muslim, siding with the Israelis, siding with the Zionists through decades of essentially what you can call subliminal suggestion and sort of subliminal programming by Zionist media, by these major trade deals with American companies, things like that, and even Donald J. Trump securing that major arms deal with Saudi Arabia in 2017. So that was all gigantic development, and I think the story, I'm not sure if we'll find out anymore, but it does force us Orthodox Christians. We do remember some major, I would say, helicopter crashes, tragedies which took place in our recent history. For those of you probably middle aged or even younger, perhaps, you've probably heard on September 11th, 2004, Patriarch of Alexandria, Peter the Seventh, died in a 17-person helicopter crash traveling from Africa, from Alexandria to Mount Athos. A lot of archimandrites and other bishops of the Alexandrian Orthodox Church died in that helicopter crash. Yeah, as you can imagine, major tragedy for the Orthodox Church in 2004, and that took place in the Aegean Sea. Very mysterious helicopter crash. I don't think we've seen a tragedy of that level in the church for a long time since then. But again, Greece announced the 3-day period of mourning. It was a major. In Russian politics, there was also a very key helicopter crash, which really, I would say, took a major player off of the Russian political scene. If you recall, in 2002, the governor of the Krasnoyarsk Oblast, Alexander Lebedь, a general during the Chechen Wars who actually assisted Yeltsin in signing the first peace treaty in the first Chechen campaign. And Alexander Lebedь was a very strong sort of Silovik power player in Russian politics at that time in the Russian Federation. And he, in fact, transitioned quite well into being a governor and managing his oblast. And he died in a helicopter crash as well, allegedly in very foggy weather in the Sayan Mountains when he was just traveling to oversee some of his governorship territories. Very mysterious. It seems like helicopter crashes, plane crashes, they do take out very key figures in world history, and this is no exception. We all recall the, as well as Colonel Dmitry Utkin crash
Mhm.
in, not really crash, but the airplane exploded in the sky over Tverskaya Oblast in just north of Moscow on the 24th of August 2023. But speaking of going back to international relations, but staying in the Middle East, I think one of the biggest stories, again, besides the death of the Iranian president, was the ICC actually finally condemning Netanyahu and the Minister of Israeli Defense, Gallant, issuing arrest warrants for them. So finally, it has arrived. The International
Yes.
Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants. But what's very curious about these arrest warrants, which were issued by the ICC prosecutor, Karim Khan, who was a King's Counsel, very allegedly skilled lawyer and judge on the International Criminal Court, is that the three leading members of Hamas were also issued with arrest warrants. So they were also invited
Right.
to join proceedings in the International Criminal Court. Again, so to me, it seems very confusing as to why Netanyahu and Gallant couldn't just be tried on their own sort of crimes and merits. Whereas, would they
Right.
really need to add these three Hamas leader figures? And the three of them are, of course, Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Al Masri, and the most notable, I think, is Ismail Haniyeh. And Ismail Haniyeh, I think, is really curious because he's someone who all these Hamas leaders are very much fervent believers. They are very fundamental in their views. I wouldn't say extreme, but if you can call people extremists for following certain ideologies, I would say these people are completely invested in this idea of a free Palestine. Hamia, for example, he's lost at least 60 family members over the last 2 decades just to this war against Zionism. And the latest loss was in November 2023 when his granddaughter died in during the Israeli bombardment of Gaza. And what's really curious is that
Mm.
the newspapers in Russia, these Hasidic Chabad newspapers, which I suppose are Zionist as well, just by adjacency, their headlines in November 2023 were "The granddaughter of Khamia has been liquidated." The granddaughter has been liquidated. This is the most
Yeah. Yeah.
inhuman thing, and this was published by a Russian Jewish website in November. So again, a huge tragedy for this man. He's been, so you can imagine these people have given up family members, have invested so much of their lives to this fight against Zionism, and to the point where many countries have labeled them as terrorists. And in fact, perhaps they have done things in their lifetimes which could be seen as terrorist acts and apprehensive. And in this fight against Israel, these people are lifetime soldiers. And now I think they would be willing, if they saw Netanyahu, Gallant, someone like Smotrich as well, if he was issued with a warrant,
Mhm.
if they
Mhm.
saw them
Mhm.
attend court in handcuffs and actually be tried and found guilty, I think these three would be willing to even be publicly executed for Palestine in order to benefit their country.
Absolutely.
They've already given up so much. I think they'd be willing to go to prison, frankly, in
Yeah.
Switzerland somewhere or in Belgium. They'd be willing to sit in a prison cell for the rest of their lives if that meant the Palestinians would somehow benefit from their sacrifice. When you see the Iranians mention their leaders as martyrs and Hezbollah doing the same, I think these three leaders of Hamas see themselves as those sort of figures as well as potentially martyrs in this battle against Zionism. So what's curious is Netanyahu and Gallant, do they see themselves as potential martyrs for the causes of Zionism? I'm not sure because Netanyahu's initial statements and his reactions to this arrest warrant was that it's just clearly anti-Semitic. Of course, what else
Yeah.
could it be? It couldn't be a proper legal procedure, or it couldn't be a questioning of your bombardment of Gaza and the indiscriminate damage that you've done to the lives of millions and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians at this point over the last more than 6 months now.
Yeah.
No, in fact, the court has to be anti-Semitic, right? The International Criminal Court, the same court which issued arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin in the first half of 2023 and arrest warrants for Matushka because she's the wife of a priest, an Orthodox Christian priest, Maria Lvova Belova, who is the head of the looking after children's affairs in Russia. The ICC issued arrest warrants for them, and that was completely fine. No one opposed it. That wasn't anti-Russian or Russophobic, but if you issue arrest warrants for Gallant and Netanyahu, that's anti-Semitism. Again, watering down that term into complete nothingness. And with the recent construction of by the US of the massive pier in Gaza, it does seem like the US is trying to make things happen very soon because the arrest warrants have been issued. Notice Joseph Biden hasn't mentioned at all, good old Joe, hasn't mentioned the arrest warrants at all, and the US is proceeding to assist Israel in building this pier. It's quite
And part of
curious
the
to me.
pier
I'm
has
wondering,
floated off.
will the US, in fact, I know the US doesn't really recognize the ICC or its authority, right? That's on one hand, right?
Mm.
Because George Bush and none of these figures would ever attend a criminal court hearing, or even if they were issued warrants, they simply would ignore them. And I think Netanyahu will probably go in the same direction. So it seems like Israel and the US are both partners in this procedure of ignoring international legal authority. And that's not that me and yourself really believe in these sort of international courts, but again, it does show you that it's not just Russia who is negligent of international sort of proceedings here. It's the main culprits of these conflicts, the US and Israel.
And for me, what's most entertaining about all of this, right, is on the show that Constantine and I do. One of the things that we've been saying for several years, even before the SMO, is you have to understand the United Nations it's a fake neutral, and the neutral in the concept of a democracy is also the objective. In a way, what it does is it validates certain decisions in the same way that when a conservative is convinced of a liberal's opinion, which takes roughly about 5 years, that's also a validation process. So when you're looking at the ICC, you have a problem. You have a problem within notions about the Schmittian exception of Israel and America, but in this case, particularly Israel, and the notions of universal values, right? So you cannot purport equality in universal values, but say the Jews in Israel are just so damn important in such ways we can't imagine that we cannot force them to live under universal values. And I always knew that this day would eventually come. And that's why the ruling is significant. It's not significant, it's completely unimportant whether Netanyahu is arrested or not. Of course, he's not going to be arrested. But there are countries, Britain, Spain, Portugal, I believe Norway or Sweden, Germany, France, who all of them are saying if he steps foot, he's going to be arrested. Now, that may or may not happen, but the fact that Rishi Sunak would announce that the day that that decision came, even before the warrants were issued, is highly significant. And the other thing I've said is that the gay or global homo or the American empire, whatever you want to call it, lives off of the notions of enlightenment, the individual democracy, liberal democracy, etc. It lives off of these universal values, the way it defines them, and it can never go back on that. It cannot revert to an earlier time in a previous incarnation where it was less about that. It will never stop until it runs down. It will eventually run down, but that is what it has to do. Now, the other thing, and I mentioned this, I think, in the last war report, or it might have been the previous one when Geo was on. I said that you have to understand that the ICC and the ICJ, the ICC is a little older, but the ICC and the ICJ, like The reason they're important for the Americans isn't it's not a contradiction that the Americans have not signed on, have not signed up, but they've not mandated them, right? It- That's not the issue. These courts are for vassals and they're for adversaries and enemies. That's the whole purpose of these courts, right? And what did we hear on Friday? We heard that one of the I think one of the American like one of the EU members said these courts are for Africans, African countries, and Putin, which is incredible because I said this before this was said. So people just have to understand how this works, right? You need the fake, just like you have a fake opposition, you need a fake neutral. You need that idea that, oh, this is objective. It's objective, right? It's what helps you have faith in the system, right? It's theopolitics, right? Politics is religious to a certain degree. And if you're going to depend on democracy, then that means every facet of life is going to become political because that's where the authority comes from democratic notions. So yes, that's what I wanted to say. That eventually I knew that this would have to happen, and now we're going to see like it's a win situation, right? If America says no, if there's not going to be like Israel is still going to be the Schmittian exception. Nancy Pelosi, will you please tell the audience how even if Washington was burning, we would still support Israel? If they do that, then that's it. They have to let go. This is not something that they can commandeer anymore. It's over. Then they lose the ICC and the ICJ. They lose it. And if they respect it, then they lose because then Netanyahu and Israel lose. So it's a win.
Yeah, just before we move on from the Middle East, I did want to mention just the really curious story about that pier being built in Gaza because me and Conrad, we spoke about a few weeks ago how this could have been a potential future Black Swan event site because you have American troops on the ground
Mm,
in the middle of the Gaza Strip of all places. Of course, no consent is being asked of the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, or any of the leaders of the Palestinian people themselves, not even the religious leaders as to, well, should we be building an American construction on this land, a pier which will be allegedly used for the World Food Program and other aid being transported, which I have no doubt that they will transport certain humanitarian aid from Cyprus to Gaza, of course, because it's necessary. But the duality here, this weird order out of chaos, or like we create the chaos and then we build the new world order after that sort of system seems to be implemented here because on one hand the US it doesn't condemn Netanyahu's actions in Gaza. On the other hand, it's allegedly building the pier which will assist the poor Palestinian peoples, which are being harassed and murdered by their great ally Israel and its prime minister. So,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
super controversial. It makes no sense. It's very Masonic. The subject of masonry will come up a little bit more when we speak about New Caledonia, but it's quite curious, this entire Gaza pier situation. And naturally, I think they're rushing it as well because we did see four of those little American boats actually stranded. So they're not actually taking into account even the tides. They needed to be pushed off the shore. There's major logistical issues happening. For whatever reason, they are building this pier at almost like extra procedural rates. A piece of the pier itself a day ago broke off and now is floating in the Mediterranean. So they're really putting some work into this $300 million pier that they're building in Gaza. Again, concerns over whether or not this will actually assist the Palestinians. I'm sure in some capacity it will, because I'm sure that the Turks on Cyprus and the Greeks do want to actually provide aid, as well as all these major NGOs. There must be
Mhm.
people who are genuinely looking to support the people of Gaza. I don't think it's all international mockery of the people, similar to how when France began dropping those massive food packages and they were squashing the poor Gazan people on the ground, like it's just insane. I think there are genuinely people who are looking to provide aid and they're just not sure how to do it, and so they will go along with this US plan. Yeah, let's build a pier. Let's make sure we can get shipments to Gaza. And the other thing that really supports this notion is the fact that shipments of aid by land are actually being interrupted by, who would have guessed it, Israeli activists, Zionist activists. Their logo seems to be a burning flame with two crossed swords behind it and some Hebrew text over it. Looks very interesting, somewhat Ukrainian.
Mm.
And there's actual footage of Israeli protesters stamping on aid packages. So they're taking them off of trucks, stopping the trucks. So they'll get a few people, surround the truck, unload the truck onto the concrete road, and begin smashing these aid packages of food, water, drinks, which are meant to go to the Palestinian people in Gaza who are currently starving. This is insane. And this is the argument that, say, the BBC newspaper is putting out. They're saying many argue that the Gazans should receive nothing while Israeli hostages remain in
Eh,
captivity.
ooh, what an
And
opinion.
I know it's very powerful. It's okay.
I didn't consider that. We should hear from the psychos. Okay, yeah.
Exactly, and it's even the BBC should consider the fact that these Israeli protesters are not in this. They're not making the distinction between Hamas and the regular Palestinians because it's Hamas who are holding these hostages, right? They're in negotiate. The average Palestinian has no word and no say in regards to negotiation of hostages, right? Which are a
Mhm.
real thing that's taking place. Hostage negotiations are an unfortunate reality of modern warfare. I think we see this in Ukraine. We saw this in the Chechen campaigns. So
Yep.
it's quite a dark quite a dark chapter, I think, of modern warfare in general, because again, it turns and I think Khodorkovsky actually mentions it in his interview, which we'll bring up in a little bit. He says that he suspects that the Chechen war criminal exchange that took place in the Chechen campaigns, not that I trust the Talmudic oligarch Khodorkovsky very much, but I think it's very clear because we've heard this from other stories that hostage exchanges very often turn out to be marketplaces. For example, you request 50,000 for a hostage, that sets a certain price on the head of that person. The next hostage, if exchanged for $40,000 or more, will either increase or decrease that average price. It creates almost like a cryptocurrency type commodity. It's really interesting. Hostage exchanges are an incredibly complex thing to deal with, and so
Yep.
these sort of newspapers like bringing up the fact that they should receive no aid while this complex exchange is taking. That's just insane because we do see the starving footage of Palestinians. The whole world can see it, and it's clear that there's a humanitarian crisis taking place. Otherwise, the need for this $300 million pier would not, and the risking lives of Americans, putting them on essentially onto Hamas territory, and Hamas is seen as a terrorist organization by the US. So them engaging on the territory of a foreign power which they deem to be terroristic, so to speak, putting the American lives at risk for the sake of humanitarian aid, if there isn't a crisis, is again somewhat useless. The Rafah invasion, we did see bombing again of the refugee camps. Israeli people are debunking these bombardments, so we just see literally like these really small buildings, you can say huts, like tents, and then a bomb drops amidst all of them, and they all get destroyed. And then we have Israeli fact checkers telling us that this place has been already depopulated. So the people have left prior to the bomb, a massive bomb dropping and destroying everything. It's okay.
Why
Right.
would they do that then? It makes no sense. It
Exactly.
makes
So
no sense.
are we talking about ancient tunnels in the desert again? Or what's happening? Or are we just destroying the tents for the sake of it? Or have Hamas mine the tents up? There's no explanation, zero accountability. No one's, Israel is accountable to no one. And on one hand, it is the natural state of the international relations, right? Every country is sovereign, answers to nobody. So Israel is really flexing that sort of natural power which it received in this like post World War II world that we live in at the moment. So very curious. But speaking of post World War II world and post colonialism and all the great things which take place on islands, on the sunny island of New Caledonia, the president of France, the Freemason Emmanuel Macron, arrives and has a tour. He has a tour by car and then by helicopter, looking at his fiefdom or the fiefdom of his lodge, looking around New Caledonia, seeing as to the destruction that has taken place. When we spoke about this New Caledonia issue, GSP, it's interesting because we mentioned
Hmm.
that it could escalate out of. We're not sure the locals, the Kalak people of New Caledonia, and some of these other tribe members. How constructive are they in their protest? And it seems that so far there's been only a few hundred injuries and only 6 deaths. So in fact, it's
Yeah.
even less violent and less deadly than BLM riots taking place inside of the US. And mind you, these people are descendants of headhunters and cannibals. No offense,
Yeah.
but New
Yeah.
Caledonia, like these people cooked Captain Cook, no pun intended. Like these people are descendants of cultures who were very warlike and very ferocious. And in fact, they're keeping their cool and
Yeah, that
they're
whole belief of eat your enemy, you get their energy, it's all that stuff.
yeah, that's right. They're protesting in a very Christian-like fashion now. So I think that's quite impressive. Touring the island, of course, putting on a show like he's the big tough man. Like just as he is the tough man in the South Caucasus and Armenia, Azerbaijan, he's also the tough man in the South Pacific. Yeah, this weird flexing, bizarre. But I think the funniest story, before I get your take on this on the New
Mm,
Caledonia issue,
mhm.
is the Freemasonic temples being raided. Because again, it's a French colony, so of course the French religion needs to be there. The presence of the Freemasonic temples are the number one sign of civilization in this new world that they've built and some of these post-colonial states. And the Freemasonic temple being raided by some of the local people, and they're mocking the different garbs they have and like looting all the chests. And it's funny the analogy I made, I think, in one of my tweets, that it seems that the descendants of the headhunters of old are now assaulting and desecrating the new world order Masonic headhunters, the free tutu, skull and bones, the people obsessed with collecting heads and skulls all over their
Right.
occult temples are in the world. And just the obsession with skulls and masonry is an interesting subject, which is a little bit esoteric. Perhaps better left for an A for hour in the future. But definitely, I think it's quite funny that you do have this like interaction between the hunters of heads in this New Caledonia situation. But New Caledonia, again, beautiful island. The French Navy does have the rights to dock there and resupply. But in the future, maybe it could be seen as an external base for China. We do need to mention New Caledonia just as a formation, as a landmass in the sort of post diluvial, post flood world. It is not a reef island. It is not a volcanic island. It's just the actual landmass, like a proper natural
Right.
formation there. So that makes it quite unique amongst some of the other islands in the Pacific. Just wanted your thoughts on the New Caledonia situation and the fact that how it's been developing, because I think potentially it could escalate or it could die down like the Haitian issue. Not that Haiti has died down. We will mention that in a little bit.
This is one of those things that when it flared up, I thought, here we go. Who's responsible for this? How are the Chinese involved in this? Because immediately I thought, because I have relatives in Australia, both in Sydney and Melbourne, so I'm a little bit aware of where New Caledonia is, and I could see why that would be advantageous for whoever controls those islands. But like when you said that the last few days, I've noticed that not a lot of dead, thank God, only six, some injured, but generally they've been fairly peaceful. So that I thought was interesting. The other is Macron flies out. So for Macron, this is absolutely crucial, right? He has to stop this from happening because ever since Niger, it's just been all downhill. And even the Americans said about a week or two ago that they too are leaving Niger. This was a lot of people said that they wouldn't leave. And to be honest, I didn't say anything because I really didn't know what was going to happen. But if you forced me to bet, maybe a few months ago or late 2023, I would have said America would just stay in Niger. But they're leaving. And that's also highly indicative of a kind of a trend that's happening. The other thing you mentioned that it just popped into my head as soon as you mentioned it, there's a Masonic temple there, which is quite ridiculous. But anyways, it's all part and parcel of the Age of Enlightenment, folks. It's funny that was attacked. Good. Just to tie it in with the ICC ruling, and we were talking about universal values. France is one of those countries that believes in the ruling. France is pivotal in that whole European tradition, the beginning of essentially winter for Western civilization. For me, I tie in the attack on the temple, also with the ruling of the ICC, the idea of universal values. Why are these temples still important if the group is no longer important? Right? It's because of the tradition that they're trying to establish as somehow the legitimate tradition of the West. That whole kind of Carl Sagan thing, like between 500 AD and 1500 AD, nothing of value ever existed. Nothing was all 1,000 years of darkness and all that kind of stuff. So that's the context I see it in.
Speaking of darkness and just really a dark story, and perhaps one of caution comes out from another island, again, across the world, but still in a somewhat relevant situation. Also, a former French colony, barbecue still rules, and there are literal cannibals still around roaming the island. The recent death of two Christian Protestant missionaries, Davy and Natalie Lloyd, who were killed in their own home, which they were renting on Haiti. So they were there in the capital of Haiti essentially providing missionary work, advocating for Protestant proselytism amongst the local population, which a lot of Haitians are already like aware of Christianity in their own little way. Perhaps some of them are Catholic, or some have integrated the Christian religion with various voodoo type cults. So voodoo is like a really big deal in Haiti. At least like 40% of people practice in some capacity. Superstitious witchcraft.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting subject, I think. But yeah, this Protestant couple, again, just living in Haiti from the US, big families, both of them quite well known in their respected state in America, and they were just slaughtered in their own home. Just shows you that when
Unbelievable.
violence breaks out, amidst this, the world heading towards a major conflict, there will be a lot of innocents left lost to petty crime such as this. And this isn't petty crime, but in the scope of war crimes taking place in Palestine and things like that, people will be lost to simply the fact that they don't have a weapon to defend themselves, or their home is insecure, or they're living in the wrong place at the wrong time. Right? It
Mhm.
really will be when this if this world conflict does escalate and does inflame itself, there will be people, unfortunately, who will be, you can almost say, collateral, left to the whims of petty criminals. We saw this during the Russian Revolution, very obviously. We saw this in the 1990s in Russia as well. It's not just world affairs that we should be concerned with, it's also where we live, who we know,
Mhm.
what communities we belong to. And these people were not in their basket, so to speak. They were on a mission to spread Christianity in Haiti. They had no security whatsoever, and they were slaughtered in their own home. And we don't even want to describe exactly the
Oh
type
my
of
God.
murder or anything, but it's that's a snapshot of the dangers which we face, I think. So again, really a word of caution, a story of caution, and condolences to those anybody who knew that particular couple, because that's
Mhm,
really sad, I
mhm.
think. But since we're in the Pacific, I think GSP will speak about these developments in Taiwan and China because
Yes.
on one hand, yeah, the big story I think of the last 2 years, the big stories have always been there's always been a flavor of fake news to them. So, well, China's been preparing to take Taiwan, China's preparing to do this, Russia's preparing to do that. In the end, nothing really takes place. But here, I think for the first time, we have seen really strong statements from the Chinese Minister of Defense, from Xi Jinping himself, from even the US, of course, moving an aircraft carrier towards Taiwan, just as they have moved their two aircraft carriers towards Israel when that situation escalated. So people are actually taking some of this political rhetoric quite seriously. Perhaps we can break down this Taiwan situation because we've spoken about the fact that now that they're building that microchip factory in America, the Taiwanese one, and they're actually
Mhm.
trying to offshore some of this Taiwanese because Taiwan is most famous for building its microprocessors, some of its this really important computer hardware, which we all use, by the way. We don't even realize it's Taiwan made. Taiwan is one of these gems of the world economy, which is situated next to a country which it deems unfriendly, which is, of course, the People's Republic of China. And for the Western world to defend Taiwan is quite crucial, especially since these factories are unique to Taiwan until alternatives are created in states such as Arizona, Texas, in some of these places in America, wherein they could be protected and production for microprocessors can be at least sustained. And so we thought that perhaps this conflict would be pushed out towards 2025 until Chinese sea defenses have been constructed and China can at least maybe begin a more procedural special military operation type event and perhaps cooperate with Taiwan in joining it to itself, shall we say, in the most diplomatic language. The events this week, GSP, have just shocked, I think, everybody because suddenly we do have, just after the visit of Putin, by the way, which again, the Western media is painting this as if Putin, wink, wink, gave the nudge to Xi Jinping and suddenly things have begun moving. But yeah, what are your thoughts on this?
I'm surprised that it came so soon after Putin's visit, but the notion that Putin somehow gave Xi the okay, it's I don't know, some of it is just it's just it's just so stupid. It's so fan fiction, as if these decisions are made long, long ago. They look for a time where, like, I would say this. It's obvious. It's more obvious in 2024 that Russia's winning the war in Ukraine than it was in 2023. Okay. And this, and then that gives China a certain amount of leverage, a certain amount of intimidation. If America didn't think that it could possibly lose these very important plants, factories, if you will, for chips, it wouldn't be trying to offshore them. Now, the only Taiwan's not the only value. Obviously, it's there as an outpost of the US. And if China takes it, then it's an outpost of China. And it aligns with very important trade routes, arguably the most important in the world. And if they're not, well, then they will be eventually. In any case, the thing I always say is it doesn't matter who's number one or two. America's not acting like they're happy about number two. That's all that matters because that is what causes things to go kinetic. I guess it shows confidence by the Chinese. Now, I know they circled the island, and then I read some articles about how China would destroy the air defense system first. The fact of the matter is, over 50% of Taiwan's trade is with China. That's his biggest trading partner. If China wanted to starve them, like they could do it. Of course, they don't want that because there's certain drawbacks to it, obviously. And in many ways, America is making the island less valuable by offshoring some of these companies. And before Taiwan was a thing, this mantle belonged to Japan and then it went to Taiwan. Okay. Because why? Because it became too expensive for Japan to manufacture these things, right? And just the way things became too expensive in America to manufacture, which is makes it all the more interesting to see that these plants are going to the US, right? When we know that people there will expect to be paid well for these jobs. The other thing too is who's going to be using these chips, right? Ultimately, if you're the country whose chips are going to be used more around the world, then maybe R&D is going to favor you more because I'm not saying like R&D naturally should favor more those companies that maybe have the most amount of reach. But sometimes those companies also sit on their laurels, and it's the smaller companies, the boutique companies that do better R&D to compete. But sometimes it isn't. Sometimes those companies don't. I can tell you within the world of photography, some very fine companies that they just died, even though they made better lenses, better camera. They were too niche. So it depends, but generally it's the big companies that do better R&D. And if a smaller company comes along, then they have to adapt. The way I see it, I don't think China actually wants a kinetic war over Taiwan. I think they want to absorb Taiwan. Eventually, they believe that they will, and but maybe it's unavoidable. Now, the US has set up tripwires, obviously, right? If there's one place where the Americans could use nukes for sure, it will be there. Would they do it? There's one thing that's been going around for nearly a year, and that is if they sink one of the American carriers, they're going to get nuked. Maybe not. We don't know that, but it's possible. I could see it. I'm just criticizing people's self-assuredness about that. I don't know, but it would be terrible, and there would be payback. What kind of payback? Whether it be nuclear, how bad would it be? I don't know. But the Chinese are not going to sink a U.S. carrier unless a U.S. carrier is perceived to be doing something that it ought not to be doing within sovereign Chinese territory, like whether you like the Chinese or not. That is how it's going to be viewed by them.
Yeah, that's right. I think, look, perfect analysis. I think we should just add that for any listeners, currently China has in fact ended its 2 days of military drills, which actually brought on all of this hype and some of these powerful statements. And naturally, a lot of the reactions by the US, Japan, some of these ally countries of Taiwan have been a little bit over the top. It's almost as if they're having drills, defensive drills of their own. Like Japan, of course, has placed all of its anti-aircraft securities on the highest alert, whereas this is taking place really like a little bit far from Japan, not really relevant. In fact,
Mhm,
the
mhm.
Chinese Navy has practiced some of its deployment strategies for flying not just planes over Taiwan and around Taiwanese airspace, but also coordinating them with their naval ships. Countries like Philippines, we discussed that crazy, unusual Philippine issue that took place with the encounter on the sea in the South China Sea with the Filipinos allegedly building a military base, naval base actually, on one of those small islands left over from World War II, and China, of course, trying to interrupt them there. So now there is a lot of contention, I think, in this particular area of the world. Now, I think a lot of the rhetoric around Taiwan, I think it's generally set out because China does see, as you've said, they do see China and Taiwan as a one country, even in more stronger terms than maybe even President Putin has and other Russian politicians have stated, like Dmitry Medvedev, about Russia and Ukraine being one country, because they still speak about Ukraine as a sort of entity which is now occupied by, say, neo Nazi forces, whereas the Chinese political rhetoric is always one China. Taiwan is a separatist state. That's not the case in the Russian Ukrainian relations, which unfortunately I would say Russia does still stick to this policy of Ukraine's president is illegitimate. And I guess that's the transition point for us because Zelensky's presidential term, the election has not taken place. And now suddenly,
Yep.
this grandmaster of all evil, allegedly, according to mainstream media, President Putin has officially declared that Zelensky is illegitimate. Now, Putin has made this statement personally during a press conference.
Yes.
He didn't, in fact, it hasn't, there's no document that's been released by the Russian government to state that this means that there won't be any cooperation or peace treaties being signed between the two countries. So Putin has said things in the past and he hasn't stuck to them. And there's been times where he's changed his mind, so to speak. It's not like he is not dynamic and not flexible. But the fact that he's pointed this out so clearly early on, I think really points towards Russia, I would say. Its new trajectory is it's going to be cemented on the fact that Zelensky is not a legitimate leader of Ukraine any longer. And this is underlined, GSP, by the interesting fact of Yanukovych,
Yeah.
the former pre Maidan president of Ukraine, attending Vladimir Putin and Belarus and some of these other Russian officials attending their visit to Belarus itself, to Minsk, where they met up with Lukashenko. And Lukashenko is also shuffling around some of his military cabinet in Belarus as well. I would say probably People are saying perhaps there'll be a new Gostomel North Kiev operation. We do know the Ukrainians have really tough defensive positions on that North Belarus front end, so I'm not sure how realistic that is. But regardless of that, we do see movement on that particular end, and it does seem like bringing Belousov with him. Putin didn't bring Belousov to China. Belousov was in fact brought to Belarus, I think, in order for this collaborative operation. So maybe there will be
Mm.
a further collaboration between these two countries on the military-industrial complex. Lukashenko is not really seeking to push himself away from Russia, but he still wants to retain some of that independence. So I think it's curious, GSP, that Putin brings Belousov, brings Yanukovych. Are we looking at a Minsk free, or this is speaking about fake news? I do need to mention that the media at the moment, as we're recording this weekend on the 25th, 26th of May, there is a lot of media news, and this began with Reuters, actually. They put out the first story that allegedly Putin is looking to sign a peace treaty with
Ah.
Zelensky and with the US. And the thing is, it's being mimicked. This story by Reuters is being mimicked by other media sources.
Yeah.
Allegedly, the on the ground sources for this are actually Russian. So they're like, oh, this is from within the Russian administration. These we have four sources who we cannot name. It's like,
Yeah, yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So Putin,
Whatever.
given all of these recent advances, given all these positive, I will say, in the Russian favor
Hitler's tired.
developments, and the increased church persecution, suddenly Putin's going to sit down at the
Yeah,
table and speak to
it worked.
Zelensky, who is illegitimate. This makes zero sense. These headlines.
Totally 0 sense.
Yeah, just want your thoughts on that, and probably transitioning to discuss, has Russia been successfully moving? I noticed some of the movement on the
Y
Volchanskin has been, yeah, there's been a lot of
y
developments, shall
uh,
we say.
Definitely, I'll get into that too. Yeah, obviously, this is a fake headline. It's ridiculous. Putin's not looking to end the war. He's not saying, "You know what? We've gained a lot, maybe too much, and the Russian people will consider it victory." They're not going to consider it victory, particularly because even the Donbass has not been completely taken. And he's winning, as I said earlier. It's if it wasn't obvious in 2023, it's obvious in 2024 that Russia's winning this war, despite the aid of over 50 countries, despite the aid from 30 countries delivering military aid. It's still not enough. And even this trip to Belarus is like a flex. We did it in 2022. We might do it again. And we probably will. I think that there's a hint of that. Obviously, this is what the West wants is to have a moment where the Russians appear weak. This will dovetail nicely into the front lines. When the Russian push into the Kharkov area began, I think it was May 10th, they went in with just 2,000 troops. In about 48 hours, that went up to 4,000. It is now believed, and this is according to Ukrainian sources, that there are about 14,000 troops divided into various amount of brigades and so on. The Ukrainians have pushed both brigades and battalions into this region, and they number in total of 38,000. So the Russians are outnumbered 2.5 to 3 to 1. Okay. Now, every time Russia finds a new place to take territory, the Ukrainians will rush personnel. They will rush reserves. In that process, the Russians will then begin to target very important assets, such as if there's an air defense system, that will go. In fact, the day that they announced the military aid package at the end of April and beginning of May, I remember Zelensky, give me 2 Patriot systems and Kharkov will be free. The Russians cannot. So they lost another Patriot system the day he said that, ironically, right? What I'm saying is they're going to focus on taking out very important stuff like the Polish crop, any of the Swedish, French, like the Caesar, mobile artillery is very important in this war because counter battery radar is so good that you cannot line up 10 cannons and just shoot for half an hour. You shoot, you get 2 volleys if you're lucky, maybe 3, and then you get out, right? As best as you can. I'm not saying this is the case everywhere. There are areas of the battlefront where it's positional, where this kind of stuff, but in very active areas, you can't do that, or you will lose that artillery piece. So the Russians are going to focus on that, okay? The other thing is they know that they're going to use up their reserves in doing this. So that opens up other possibilities and other fronts. Take, for instance, what's happening right now in Donetsk and a little bit of what's happening in the Kupiansk front. In the past few days, the Russians have gained territory They took Beres and they took which is near Kis, and it's another town right next to it. It also starts with a K. Was also taken today. These are small villages, yes, granted, but they are south from Kupiansk. They're quite a distance, so they're not like Sinkovka, but it's an important area because there's very few defense lines between it and Kupiansk. The other thing that's happening, the Russians are steadily increasing their grip on Krasnogorovka, which is in the south of Donetsk. They've expanded their control around Chasov Yar and Bakhmut. For instance, they took over Klishevka completely, both heights, both areas. So what you're seeing is an expansion, a constant gradual expansion into these areas. And the way they do it is they get the Ukrainians rushing from one place to the other, because if they don't, they will pour in more men. Now, the amount of men obviously is not enough. The Russians are not going to take over Kharkov with the apparent 48,000 men. Remember when Russia had only 35 to 40,000 men? They were going to take over Kiev, a city 3 times the size of Kharkov. It was a ridiculous idea. When you see a Reuters article, what they're trying to do is they're trying to build a similar narrative. They know that the Russians are not serious about taking over that city. They know that it's a ploy. In fact, this time it's a much bigger ploy than it was even then. Then it was like, I don't know, some kind of flex that Putin thought he was going to do, and that was going to convince the and I mean it nearly worked, and it would have saved a lot of lives, but in the end it didn't. But and I'm talking about the peace negotiations that have started very quickly in Belarus and then in Turkey. So I would say you're seeing a lot of gains for the Russians, particularly after the fall of Avdiivka. The Russians have the initiatives. The Russians took, for instance, the last week of April to the first week or second week of May, the Russians took more territory than what Ukraine took all last year. So yeah, so it does make a difference. Reuters basically wants you to believe that the Ukrainians stopped them in stopped the Russians in their tracks. They're on the ball. Don't worry. Kharkov isn't going to fall. The Russians failed again, and Putin is looking for peace. They have to flip the whole thing around. In fact, the Russians know that the Ukrainians have to look strong in order to continue to get funding from the West. Right? The West does not want to go in this war. That doesn't mean they won't, but they don't want to, and they expect as long as the Ukrainians are still willing to defend every inch at whatever cost, or try crazy stuff like take for instance Krinky in the south and Kherson, right? They've completely abandoned Krinky now. Well, that's because they're rushing battalions from that area, which was an entire 7 to 8 months of wasted lives that achieved nothing. But it for the Western normie, to them it sounds, wow, they crossed the Dnieper. Wow, they have a toehold. My mind is already racing and figuring out how they're going to take Crimea. Like it's that's what you're dealing with, right? That's the public.
No, I think it's really curious how, despite all of these Russian pushes, of course, the media is attempting to claim that now allegedly Putin is not just satisfied, but he's desperate for a peace treaty. The only thing I think Putin is desperate for is to continue his successes. I think because everybody's really calling for it. The Russian public, I think, is a little bit tired of this war. They're tired of the stalemate. They're happy with what's taking place in terms of Kharkov, the front being pushed out away from Belgorod. They're happy that the city of Belgorod, the bombardment has at least being delayed somewhat. The sort of intermission period is increased. Notice we have realized, GSP, over the last week or so, maybe 2 weeks, the bombardment on Ukrainian energy sites has been reduced. So maybe this is what Reuters is using as evidence of the fact that Putin's no
Well,
longer pressuring, is the fact that, yeah.
there was a very significant attack tonight, and we
Oh,
don't
there we go.
know. Yes, especially Western regions.
Hmm.
In fact, U.S. and Polish planes are patrolling the Ukrainian-Polish border. Massive attack, but it only started like a little bit before you and I started recording. So who knows? We could see those energy systems destroyed. Many of them are destroyed far worse than they were in 2022. Like the Russians in 2022 basically damaged these thermal plants in ways that they knew that they could be eventually rebuilt. It was a caution to them. And in 2023 and 2024, that's not the case anymore. They're past that point. When this war started, I said that the Russians would basically take on, much to the chagrin of many Ukrainians, but they would take on the role of a parent that has to discipline a child. So they would have to be, even before the war started. I said that they're going to play this role of slow to anger, generally more forgiving. This is the parent, this is the adult, so on and so on. It's an important psychological factor in this war. It's easy to forget.
Speaking of parenting and chastising one's children, I think we see massive, not just massive shuffles taking place in the Russian military industrial complex, but in the army itself now. It's moved on from just the public servants in the Ministry of Defense. We saw Timur Ivanov, Kuznetsov, some of these figures, and those under them as well are being arrested, being charged with corruption of various
Mm,
levels and scales. A lot of them are actually going on house arrest. The funny thing is, Timur Ivanov, his pre-trial hearing, his lawyer is a very well-known defense lawyer in Russia at the moment, but he brought all of Timur Ivanov's medals to the hearing and put them up on a table, and they made like he
mm.
built a massive Lego castle on his on the court desk full of medals and boxes, and it looked hilarious. But okay, so that's supposed to somehow make a media storm, and it's okay. Timur Ivanov, we understand your wife is a citizen of Israel, your children are Israeli citizens. We understand you love lavish medals and rewards, but you don't have to flex it in the courtroom. It's inappropriate. I think we all acknowledge that he has done things to push the Russian military industrial complex into a certain direction. And we're not saying he's not a gifted administrator. We've given all those disclaimers before. But this hearing is about his interesting mansions on the coast of the Volga next to former Stalingrad, Volgograd, some of those major developments. And where did he acquire the funds for all of those things? And Kuznetsov was even weirder because we discussed his arrest last week, and he was arrested. They found like gold bars and like piles of American US dollars in his house, like that. And the arrest was taking place like the FSB broke in wearing SWAT gear into his house as well. So a bit more violent there. But speaking about this, the arrests and the movements of generals, General Shamarin, who was the head of the main communications directorate of the Russian armed forces, so in charge of military communications, a very crucial role. For those who know military history, perhaps a lot more than I do as well, you would understand that in 1941, when Nazi Germany during Operation Barbarossa invaded the US Soviet communications was so bad that at some point entire groups of tanks could not communicate with one another. They couldn't coordinate well. Communications is such a key element of modern warfare and even 20th century warfare. Everybody has electrical devices. Communicating between armed forces is absolutely crucial. And this communications director was allegedly the head of this massive bribery chain, and he was in charge of a lot of corruption and taking bribes himself, as well as probably underfunding the communications branch of the Russian armed forces. And this was covered by actually Andrei Morozov, codename Moors. He's a very famous Russian military journalist who, unfortunately, in late 2023, committed suicide because of despair and
Mm.
depression. He was popular in Telegram for a while. He himself was actually a specialist in communication. He was stating that the Russian military was under-equipped in its communication devices. The trenches during the early periods of the SMO, there was a lot of oversight on that and a lot of negligence by the Russian armed forces. And it looks like General Shamarin was the guy in charge of it all. Now he's being arrested. God willing, he's brought to justice and for all the crimes that he's committed against his own country, I would say, because that's borderline equivalent to treason. Thousands of Russian lives are probably lost for some of his sites. I think hopefully the investigation will be made public so we can at least see what kind of damage has been done to the Russian armed forces since he's been in that particular role. But it does the story of Moore is of course a dark one. We didn't cover it when it took place only because it was such a dark story. He ended up shooting himself. He was ideologically speaking maybe very loosely orthodox and was more of a MAGA communist type Stalinist in his ideology. So he was very much like a neo-Soviet type of guy, and that I think also contributed to this nihilistic outlook. And he was quite depressed. He was, if you can imagine Igor Strelkov doom posting, his doom posting was 5x that. It
Oh,
was,
wow.
yeah. But he was a really good journalist and he was covering very pertinent issues on the war front. And unfortunately, he's not with us today, but it does show that, never take your own life, never even think about doing that. That is all from the devil, because if he had survived 5 more months, right, he would have seen
Right.
his work come to fruition. And here, General Shamanin's being arrested. Some of the other movements was Lieutenant General Sukhrab Akhremetov. He's a lieutenant general of the 20th Army in Russia. He's been in this position similar to Rustam Muradov. Rustam
Hmm.
Muradov, if you recall, late 2022 GSP, he was the commander of
Yep.
the Eastern Military District. And Sukhrab was actually the general in charge of the Ugledar disaster in late 2022, I believe, or early 2023. But that was a massive military disaster before the siege of Bakhmut really kicked off with Prigozhin, really sieging that city hard. Ugledar was essentially the Russian army's operation to try and get around Bakhmut. Just I think it's the southwestern section of it in order to avoid these major Ukrainian defenses, and it failed. And a lot of Russian tanks were taken out. A lot of Russian casualties were reported. The footage was horrifying, and it seems like the two
Yes.
generals in charge of that are now being removed from their posts. And Sukhar Akhmedov, yeah, he's a. You can see by the name, these people are of a North Caucasus type, Dagestan, Chechen, perhaps
Yeah.
descent, which is really curious that they were in charge of such key positions. It shows how inclusive the Russian military structure really is, if you think about it. We have big shuffles, right? Two generals, and now the trials. This is the really contentious one. General Ivan Popov, we covered this.
Yeah.
This is, I think, when World War Now had just begun in October 2022. Shortly after that, General Ivan Popov, who was in charge of some of the, he was actually a very hands-on Suvorov type general, very much in the front lines himself, working with the troops, very like a man's man. His nickname was Spartacus, and he called the people under him Spartans. And in fact, he had a private Telegram channel between him and his officers. Imagine like a group chat of sorts. And he would chat to
Oh,
the
wow.
officers under him, and he would say certain things about Shoigu and about the military-industrial complex in Russia that he wasn't happy with, or we're not getting enough supplies, similar to maybe some of
Hmm.
Prigozhin's
Hmm.
complaints. General
Yeah.
Ivan Popov was seen as this like a real people's general, and even the last name similar to Zhukov, very appealing to the Russian average soldier. But he was removed from his role and placed under house arrest early on in the SMO, about a year after the SMO begun, and now his
And
trial.
strangely, after achieving victories,
Exactly. So
Popov.
it's not like he wasn't unsuccessful. He was actually one of the successful generals who the troops liked
Yep.
him. He's like a handsome looking guy. He could have been this a real figurehead personality, because of course we lack personalities because a lot of these Russian troops are wearing masks, well, for good reason, but the generals aren't. And so it was interesting to see this Russian general actually rise up to his own troops, and then of course him being moved aside, similar to Surovikin. Surovikin had extreme popularity at the end of 2022, and suddenly he was shifted aside after the Prigozhin revolt. That's a bit of a different story. But Ivan Popov, what is he being tried for? Allegedly, he misappropriated 1.1 million American dollars, which is, I think, 200 million rubles worth of steel for some Zaporozhye defense lines, which are those Surovikin
Mhm.
defense lines along the Zaporozhye Oblast held by Russia. Allegedly, he misappropriated that steel and metal and all those important defensive materials, which was supposed to be meant for the defense structure, and he allocated them elsewhere, and that's his charge, and he's being tried for treason very soon by a military court. And a lot of Russian, I would say, patriotic bloggers are very concerned about this. They're stating that this is simply a made up case. General Popov, I believe, will be pleading not guilty. And it's curious development because we do see a lot of the corruption charges are very strong. And on one hand, it's good because you do need to, Belousov and some of his people, and the fact that Belousov is an economist, I think, is very clear here. It's not even to restructure the military industrial complex, but it's to audit the entire thing. What has been happening here for the last 2 years or even longer, maybe even since 2014, maybe since Serdyukov's days before Shoigu was the Minister of Defense. And notice how Shoigu is not getting in trouble. He's like the good old boy Moshe.
Mhm.
He's not being
Mhm.
touched. He's sitting on the sidelines. His hands are clean. He's like Pontius Pilate in this entire thing. And meanwhile, the generals are getting all the flack. Hey,
Right.
there's big movements. And before you comment on this reshuffling of the Russian military industrial complex, I do want to shout out a very interesting interview. Not because the interviewer himself is, let's just say, pro-Russian or anything. He's not even Orthodox. If anything, I think he's like a former Orthodox liberal. I would say even libtard. The Russian channel is Dudes, and on the Dudes interview channel, he interviews Mikhail Khodorkovsky himself, that famous Talmudic Jewish oligarch who was the richest man in Russia between 2000 and 2003. And in this interview, Khodorkovsky, he's revealed who was behind his famous gas and oil company, Yukos, which was the most successful gas and oil company until Khodorkovsky was arrested in October 2003. This is before the Russian election in 2003. Khodorkovsky revealed that Lord Jacob Rothschild himself was the second man in charge of Yukos, and he had all the keys. And according to Khodorkovsky, if Khodorkovsky was ever arrested, this Russian oligarch, Lord Jacob Rothschild himself from Great Britain would take control of Yukos and would have all the key decision-making capabilities. So Just shows that we speak about the 1990s and the early 2000s, the Rothschild family itself, no joke, were directly involved in some of these machinations around the
Yep.
Yeltsin government, and it seems like they perhaps there's some opposition between the Rothschild family and Putin's administration, but maybe there's personal beef there as well. A really curious revelation, but just want to get your thoughts, GSB, about this. Yeah, the generals, because it's on one hand it's
Yeah.
demoralizing, on the other hand maybe it's positive. It's hard to judge.
It is hard to judge. I did see a hilarious the Telegram channel Missiles and Nukes. It's just they're just it's a bunch of funny guys. They're all shit posters. And so there's a graphic with Putin interviewing Shoigu, and underneath his desk there's a button, and it's the Gulag button, and Putin is looking Shoigu in the eye like nothing's wrong, and he's pressing the Gulag button for Shoigu. I wish, but this issue of corruption, it loomed over Russia in 2022, and it was forgotten in 2020, mostly because Bakhmut was taken and the Ukrainians failed in the counteroffensive. And that seemed to show that the Russians were still capable of holding on and even adapting, even succeeding. That the troops were not really that demoralized if they were willing to go to Bakhmut, but Bakhmut itself showed, maybe issues of production. I think the issues of production weren't necessarily Shoigu and Gerasimov laughingly while Prigozhin and Utkin's and their troops suffered in Bakhmut. I think it was really just Russia having to adapt, and we need more shells, right? And they're contending the best shells in the world, the 155 millimeter. A lot of these shells apparently travel with greater like they can outrange the Russians, and they also go at faster speeds. According to one thing I read today, are some generals like, is Popov an innocent man? I I don't know. Some of these guys are obviously not innocent. Obviously, they underperform, and I think Putin. Shoigu is out of the picture in some ways. In some ways, he has an even bigger role. His role between, let's say, the financial industrial planning for the military and the military itself, that position that he used to occupy is gone. That in and of itself is interesting. And the guy who's replacing him apparently is a good Orthodox Christian. To me, he seems very Russian. He's not a mix. It could be good. I think it's too early to tell. Generally, like, to do this purge now while things are good, you can look at that as confidence, that it could be a harbinger of, maybe harbingers, it could be an omen of better things to come, because maybe the operations will change. We see the West being using rhetoric that is more confrontational, hit inside Russia. I think in many ways they're planning on. I hope it's not just a guise, because I guess by now, like, I don't know, I'm not certain. But if this is a legit purge, then it will be to streamline the industrial capacity of Russia, because they do not expect this war to end in this year. And they are foreseeing that either their operation will grow in order to get the war to end sooner than later, or that the West will do something that will escalate the war. And they cannot afford to have corruption under these circumstances, because I think it's dawning on people how serious. I think they accept it now, but maybe there's still a few people out there who think, oh, if we lose it, life goes on. Maybe I could. Yeah, there's many foolish people, but that is what I think is probably the reasoning behind it.
Regarding arrests, of course, were those in public service positions also recently apprehended, which have ties to prominent figures in Russian domestic politics. So, the Ingushetia Republic, I'm sure listeners have heard that name before. We mentioned that when there was a terrorist cell, this is shortly prior to Crocus City Hall, that disaster on the eve of Purim at the end of March that took place. Ingushetia, it's a small little Islamic type republic located next to Dagestan and Chechnya. And so Ingushetia, the actual head of the republic, his older brother was arrested for corruption, allegedly millions and millions of dollars. And it's a small republic, so you'd think these are really substantial funds. So the head of the republic, Magomed Bashir Kalimatov, his brother was in fact arrested, and he's going to be facing trial as well. And this is quite key because, again, some of these Islamic republics, we do know there's a lot of funds from central Russian territories actually going there in order to keep the peace between any potential separatist actors and any bad actors in those particular places to keep them happy. But here we see Russia openly now that after Crocus City Hall, they're putting their foot down, and I think that's probably a positive development. And again, you'd think so. He's only a brother of one of the governor of this oblast, or this little Muslim republic. That's the thing. How corruption works, especially in Russia and countries of Eastern Europe, is usually you sign property and corrupt your funds. You sign them in companies. You sign them under the names of your relatives, including brothers, wives, mothers, grandfathers, etc. That's usually how it works, which is why this Kulimatov story is quite curious. But
Hmm.
it just does paint a sort of picture of it looks like with the movements after Crocus City Hall. Russia is looking to suppress that Islamic element at least somewhat, or at least make moves administratively to address as in what's been taking place with in terms of immigration. Now, why does Ingushetia, Chechnya, Dagestan, because these countries are not immigrant countries, these are members of Russia and they're native peoples of the Russian landmass. Why does that how does that relate to the Tajiks? There's been a recent move of people of Islamic background immigrating to Russia and actually wearing full-on burqas, niqabs in Moscow in the subways. And Russia, Moscow, if you've ever been to Moscow, it's a very CCTV heavy city. They utilize it to keep people safe. CCTV cameras everywhere. Burqas, niqabs. It's been discussed by Russian conservative politicians that they completely obfuscate the image of a person, and potentially it could be a man behind the burqa. Like, I know it sounds a little bit comical, but it literally could be a man. We remember the Nord-Ost terrorist act in early 2000s when the Chechen Islamists and Shahids and Shahid women actually hid explosives as well as AK-74s and other submachine guns beneath their niqabs and burqas. When in Russia, when you hear of burqas and niqabs, you don't think about Islamic piety. You think about terrorism and you think about
Yes.
people hiding things under those clothes. I'm sure it's probably the same in countries of former Yugoslavia. These garments are not even native to Russia at all. The Muslims of Tatarstan, the Muslims of Chechnya never wore niqabs and burqas. They had their own traditional clothing, but even I think
Yep.
countries like Uzbekistan and Tajikistan have banned niqabs and burqas, and now the Russian conservative politicians within even United Russia are some moving slowly towards the potentially running a bill that would ban these items of clothing because they simply cover too much of the person up. You don't know who it is underneath, and even police officers, there's all these discriminatory matters which are brought up when a police officer stops a woman wearing that sort of clothing. Well, it's only the husband can see my face, but ma'am, I need you to identify yourself. It's like all these concerns. It's really out of place, really, frankly, especially on Russian subways when there's a real risk of terrorism. And yeah, that move on the Burqa and Niqab, how does that relate to immigration? It stops this sort of this Islamic supremacy movement. And of course, how does this relate to the Northern Caucasus and Ingushetia? That's because the Chechen, the chief mufti of Moscow, this is the guy who looks like the Chudjak emoji, like
Oh,
the yes, with the
yes.
eyebrows. He's
I
spoken
know.
out.
Oh yeah.
He spoke out in favor of the burqa, despite the fact that in his own country where he's from, the burqa and niqab are not a common garment to wear by Islamic women
Yes.
anyway. But he's this is discriminatory against the Muslims of Moscow, and it's buddy. This is clearly some sort of colonial logic you're using here. In fact, he himself, he doesn't he never ever speak out against the ban of that particular garment in Central Asian countries, and I believe even in Turkey, and burqas and niqabs are not really seen as normal. It's not really a common. It's more of an Arabic Hijaz, Arabian Peninsula type of garment. It's not mandatory in Islam at all. It's not like the just wearing the veil over your head for women. So very curious how he spoke out in favor of it. Shows exactly who's against Russian national politics and who's for it. These weird Chechen pro-Islamic actors are really not doing Russia any favors. But in terms of Russia being in the news again, in terms of geopolitics, the Norwegian ban on Russian travel has been instituted. The Norwegian parliament is going to restrict Russian travel, tourism, business travel to Norway very severely. But that raises the question again. Norway and Russia have always had very friendly relations throughout history. In fact, going back to the 1400s, and even maybe earlier than that during the medieval period, Russian sailors, the Pomorian fishermen from the Russian northern Karelian coast, would always travel up the Arctic around to Norway sometimes to fish in their lands, and they would always trade. They would catch whales together. There was all kinds of joint sort of commercial operations. In regards to the island of Spitsbergen, I think it raises the issue of a potential Russian-NATO international relations clash. Now, what is Spitsbergen? It's one of the major islands on the Svalbard archipelago. That's, if you can imagine, if you look at the map of the world, This is located north of Norway and north of the Nové Zemlya, new land, which is just, of course, north of Angelsk, Murmansk. This is way into the Arctic Ocean, like next to Greenland. There's a small archipelago, which is technically speaking, essentially these islands are Norwegian, but Russians have had, of course, dealings with these islands. They've caught whales there. They've went seal hunting there for like centuries at this point. These places are very populated by high quality fish, as well as Russian miners for coal have been operating on Spitsbergen for a long time. In fact, the Russians even have their own name for Spitsbergen, which
Mhm.
is Grumont. And the Russians have cooperated with Norway, and now NATO has sought to disrupt the relations between these two formerly friendly countries. It's completely uncalled for, and hopefully there are a lot of Russians at the moment, coal miners, fishermen living on Grumont, Spitsbergen. It does look like this is a potentially an escalation point because to limit their travel as well to this island, which is frankly very far away from Norway, but also far from Russia, and it's almost like an Antarctica type situation. It's used by multiple countries to achieve their own ends. Super
And it,
concerned.
and it, yeah, and it also has this kind of veil of environmental protection because it's a very rare type of caribou that lives on these islands, which is genetically drifting from the other because of course it's so isolated. And of course, polar bears and that kind of thing. The West always uses these kinds of reasons why it has to expand, right? There's always, I don't know, a polar bear it's saving. The US, in fact, has claimed hundreds of thousands of miles of new seashells, particularly around Alaska, because of course this is, I think, where they see the next, as you rightly say, the next possible flashpoint in this war. There'll be more than one battle. Ukraine is just one of them. What probably disturbed the Americans a few years ago was just how profitable and just doable Russian trade during months when the ice sheets in the Arctic Ocean were not an obstruction. And they know that the Chinese are also working with the Russians in this regard. For the Americans, it just gets in the way of the isolation that they hope to achieve around Russia. They're going to do this. They're going to set up tripwires. It's like what they're trying to do is suffocate Russia. It's not that Russia is going on a rampage.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking about like Orthodox countries being pressured into overreacting, I think it's really curious. The Mitsotakis government in Greece has really failed to negotiate anything over the church in Kora. Of course, the Church of the Savior being converted into a mosque. It's still operating as a mosque to this day. It's only been 2 weeks, but that development really hasn't gone anywhere. Greek relations with Turkey have really soured. Turkey currently is attempting to build marine parks in the Aegean Sea right next to Greece without sort of consulting Greece. There's, of course, the constant concern of Greece over, say, Turkish expansion, even these like marine park projects, right? Allegedly, the marine park is mainly to preserve Aegean Sea biodiversity. So the Turkish government is very concerned about biodiversity in some of these really key geopolitically strategic areas close to Greece, which is, I think is a little bit curious, but we do see these major concerns. Greek politicians are actually speaking out and saying that Turkey is openly threatening Greek sovereignty at this point. And it's funny how they say that. That's considering just the domestic developments in Greece, the support for Ukraine, the sort of standing behind the idea of NATO, moving away from any sort of alliance with Russia or any sort of solidarity with Christians around the world, solidarity around being opposed to persecution taking place there by the Kiev Zelensky regime, seeing the Greek politicians pivot and dive, they're basically changing directions. It's almost as if they're appealing to a vast swath of their electorate. They're trying to get both the liberals and the conservatives. And of course, the legalization of gay marriage was, I think, the cherry on top of that cake. And unfortunately, still in power at the moment. Greece is headed for, I think, essentially not just geopolitical, but domestic disaster long term. Unfortunately, it just does look like that. They're not really, unlike Georgia, which has recently really passed. I think it really that foreign agent bill was a great development. The Soros groups and NGOs very upset by that. So I think that was a move in the right direction. But Greece is not doing that at the moment. And we even see, of course, their main opposition in the region, Turkey, attempting to draft the foreign agent bill, which we mentioned last week. They're still moving ahead of that, by the way. So Turkey is actually taking lessons here. But what the other, of course, big development at GSP, I really want your opinion on this. The Srebrenica vote in the United Nations, and this is returning us full circle. One of the last stories we'll cover today before we briefly mention the church persecution towards the end of the episode. The Srebrenica vote, this is quite crazy. So again, claiming that the Serbian people were in charge of this massive genocide. Everybody voted on it. And Serbia, in fact, I think the majority did vote for that fact. China, Russia, again, did not agree, but I think
Yep.
for Vucic, it was good seeing Vucic wrapped in the Serbian flag, really sort of flexing his country's sovereignty, in despite the fact that his position is not the popular one in Europe at the moment. Despite all of these conservative European parties rising, Vucic is really the minority here, and Srebrenica, I think, was an expected loss, but still quite souring to see that a lot of these European countries are still very much under the heel of NATO.
And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about the implementation of universal values and a universal court and so on. The vote for Srebrenica in the UN wasn't such an overwhelming vote. A lot of countries abstained. They did get solid support from 19 different countries. Obviously, the whole point of it was to punish Serbia. Remember that the West tried another color revolution around Christmas and in January. That failed. They tried to strong arm the Serbians into sanctioning Russia. That didn't work. So this is punishment. This is punishment. And there were flare ups. I'm not saying the West was responsible for every flare up that happened in Kosovo, but I would say at least one or two were in the last 2 years. And definitely they were using the Albanian police as provocateurs. Maybe the reaction from the Serbs came later. Of course, it was very disappointing to see the country of my origin, Macedonia, and other countries like Bulgaria, Croatia vote in favor of this stupid motion, but not unexpected given these countries. But it's essentially punishment for not going along. It's looking for a political win, and there's a lot of great videos out there debunking Srebrenica. They've been around for a long time, and even if you take those figures, they are minuscule compared to what Benjamin Netanyahu is doing. And in fact, that it's timed very significantly. The whole thing is to soften the blow for Israeli Jews. Oh, we're going after Hamas and the Serbs. We're not singling you out. We're not anti-Semites. Yeah.
Interesting. I think now that we're on the subject of the Balkans, I think it's worth mentioning the other big story in church news, and this will be the final segment for this week. I think the reaction of the Archbishop of the Macedonian Church to Constantinople's proposal of granting a tomos, an official sort of recognition of the Macedonian Orthodox Church Ohrid Archbishopric, granting them sort of
Mm.
autonomy by Constantinople. This proposal was underlined by certain conditions, such as that ecumenical patriarchate would like the Macedonian Orthodox Church to recognize the Ukrainian schismatics,
Mm.
and the Archbishop of the Macedonian Church actually has called this unacceptable completely. And he said that, look, we wouldn't mind, now that we've accepted, firstly, the Belgrade Serbian Tomos, right, we wouldn't even mind for the sake of honoring the ecumenical patriarchate, accepting Tomos from the Greeks as well. Of course, there's nothing really bad about that. It's just two documents
Mm.
here we're looking at. Doesn't really change anything. But the other condition was that the Church of Macedonia would need to change its name and remove the word Macedonian from the church's name. And this was also, and this is curious, the EP that's
Yeah.
outright requested that. This is a big story you can read about on orthochristian.com, guys, especially this next week. It'll be probably on the front news. And the Archbishop, I think, strongly, he understands like the Damocles sword of separatism in the Orthodox Church of Serbia and Macedonia, Montenegro has really been blunted recently by I think, by the Holy Spirit, by God Himself, through the acts of some of these high clergymen who actually agreed to make peace rather than war and put aside the differences and agree to
Yeah.
not be blackmailed by the ecumenical patriarchate and those handling,
Yeah.
Patriarch Bartholomew, like some of these CIA agents, Mike Pompeo or whomever is behind all of
Yeah.
this. But so it's really a great
I'm so
development. Mhm.
yeah, it's one of those rare instances where I'm very proud. The other thing that has occurred to me, you're talking about the Holy Spirit and the way things might be moving. Obviously, I was in Istanbul for a week. I went to see an old friend of mine, Armenian, and he lived literally if you went outside his front door, because it's a very hilly area. This is the old quarter, and there's a church up there. It's a mosque now. There was almost no change done to it, obviously, because both incorporate the dome and so on. And so I saw this firsthand there, right? But I guess what I'm getting at is the time that Turkey would turn on Russia is when Greece would befriend Russia. That's when Turkey would fall in line with NATO's wishes. He knows how things are happening the way they are, but I don't know. It's just something I've been thinking about.
We know the right wing and the conservative parties are rising in Greece, especially this recent like legalization of gay marriage and all of that. Very concerning for the Christian majority Orthodox Christian population of Greece. So eventually, I think this will lead to, hopefully, right, God willing, a snowball effect wherein conservatives in Greece will take over. But yes, you're right, the watchdog of NATO, the watchdog of the United States, their closest ally besides Israel itself is Turkey, of course, the potentially post Erdogan government, as you know, we've spoken with Conrad and yourselves, you guys have probably analyzed this a lot. If once Erdogan goes, who knows
Yeah.
exactly where Turkey will go? It's
Mhm.
what a lot of the saints speak about prophecy wise. It's actually quite scary because Turkey is this major military power, a gigantic army, gigantic capacity. And the only, I would say, weakness of Turkey at the moment is that it isn't a nuclear power, unlike some of these other, I would say, second rate military countries like Pakistan, perhaps. But even that could probably
Yep.
be easily circumvented simply by the fact of if Iran allegedly has developed its first nuclear missiles, which they've announced 3 weeks ago, funny enough, before Raisi is passing. I mean, they, at least that's according to them. There's no real evidence that they have developed nuclear missiles. Turkey, what's really stopping Turkey from, if the world really breaks down, from really at fast speed developing some of these things in the mountains of Anatolia? We really shouldn't rule that out. And Turkey with nuclear capabilities would be a real player in the Mediterranean game, even more than it is now.
Oh, yeah.
Scary. And of course, the last story of the week is the destruction of the Church of the Tithes. Last week we did mention
Yep.
it briefly, but it's been confirmed the church has been demolished in the dead of night. The way it took place was actually quite significant, given that we are a few weeks in the Easter period now, and we do, of course, remember Passion Week, Holy Week. It's still in our mind, and after, of course, the Last Supper, after communion, Judas at night went to the Sanhedrin, and they organized the Sanhedrin Guard to go and entrap Christ and the apostles in Gethsemane garden in the dead of night. And this is what exactly has taken place here in the center of Kiev and some of Kiev's older suburbs where the Church of the Tithes once stood until last week, unfortunately, when it was demolished. So in the dead of night, these massive demolition trucks and equipment drove towards the church, all, and this is really curious because this is again this combination of antichrist type technology with just brutal persecutor power. We have these massive trucks, equipment, modern machinery going there to destroy this little church, to which the Mother of God herself appeared in 2006, which is one of the biggest
Mm.
miracles that took place in Kiev, like in the last 2 decades, right? And still, that is the specific church that they wish to destroy. And so the trucks arrive, the GPS signals and the mobile signals in those particular two suburbs where this church is located, this territory, all the mobile signals shut down in this area. So the Ukrainian government specifically shut down all the mobile towers. There's no connection. Wi-Fi is not working. People can't go on the internet and live stream the church being destroyed. They can't report on it. It's almost as if they use this EMP type technology, right? Or just simply
Yeah.
collaborating with the private companies there to make this happen, this antichrist type move. The church was destroyed, and we saw for this entire week the people of Ukraine who are still adhering to the canonical Orthodox Church have been visiting the site of the Church of the Tithes, of the Theotokos, and putting down flowers, praying there, getting on their knees, bowing, showing signs of respect. Priests, clergymen, laity. It's just a place of pilgrimage, essentially. Not just mourning, but also Christians of Ukraine who are still Orthodox, still canonical, still have not fallen to heresy, are showing their solidarity. And we haven't seen this many Christians in one place in Kiev in a long time. It's almost as if they're not attending some of these schismatic cathedrals, the Kiev Pechersk Lavra churches, which have been occupied and taken over by the schismatics, which are now standing empty every Sunday and every Saturday night. No one's going to these services. People are going to places wherein the Holy Spirit abides. And it's places like this site of the Church of the Tithes, which has just recently been destroyed. In terms of this particular story, the former caretaker of this church, who was actually the archimandrite, he was the priest who was there in 2006 when this miracle took place with the Theotokos' appearance.
Uh,
Back then, he was a priest, Father Gideon Haron. And Father Gideon, since he was promoted to a vicar auxiliary bishop of Kiev, and he was assisting Metropolitan Onufri. But since then, unfortunately, due to his positions on the SMO, the Ukrainian government has relinquished his Ukrainian citizenship. And so in 2023, he requested that Metropolitan Onufri release him from his position as a bishop and send him into retirement. So he's a retired bishop today, but he appeared on Russian television on Spas TV, which is run by our good friend Andrei Afanasyev, who I'm sure our listeners have listened to our episode, and we recommend the A4 Hour interview with Andrea Afanasiev. It was just absolutely crucial in terms of understanding the SMO, I think, from an Orthodox Christian perspective. So if any of you guys haven't listened to it yet, definitely go out, check it out. It's one of our best episodes in terms of viewership, as well as, I think, feedback. People have, Andrea Afanasiev is probably the foremost in terms of young, energetic Orthodox Christian journalist around in Russia today. And his English is great too. So the interview turned out to be very successful. We'll definitely have him on in the future. But Andrei Afanasiev was interviewing Bishop Gideon and also the famous Ukrainian journalist. By famous, this guy is just the one of the shining pillars of Ukrainian Orthodoxy from a layman's perspective. Of course, we're speaking about Jan Taksur here, who sat in Ukrainian prison in 2022 after the SMO. He's almost like a confessor type status. Now he lives in Moscow with his family because Ukraine is simply unsafe for him. He would probably get assassinated or something like that.
Oh
He's
yeah.
a popular Ukrainian Orthodox journalist and a resident of Kiev who considers himself Russian. His family is like multi generational Kievan resident citizens of the land, which is now called Ukraine. But of course, he considers himself a Russian as much as anybody else, in fact. So, very good sort of solidarity type opinion coming from Jan Taksur. But Jan Taksur did say that the Ukrainian Orthodox Christians, the way they protest is not like what we see during, even in New Caledonia and Haiti, the protests are very different. During BLM riots, speaking about George Floyd and all those things that potentially will take place again in the US pre the November 2024 election. The Ukrainians, they protest as the early Christians did. They do not attend these pagan worship events, they do not attend these schismatic conferences and church services. They worship in their homes in privacy and they pray for the Lord to assist them. They protest through prayer like the Christians of the first 3 centuries, and that's his argument for why you don't see these Ukrainians going on the streets and like the yellow vest in France. He says it's a very different type of protest. The really pious Orthodox Christians, those who haven't been yet conscripted, murdered, or who haven't fled abroad, those who have to remain in order to look after like elderly or disabled relatives or something of that sort, or simply do not have the means to leave, they remain still loyal and pious. And I think that was a really good message that Jan Taksur sent out, that Ukrainians are not just sheep. In fact, Orthodox Christians do not need to
Mhm.
resist physically or violently. Sometimes we can protest through prayer, through seeking, I would say, guidance from God as to how to act next. And this is exactly what they're doing in their hundreds. And them showing up to the Church of the Tithes, the spot where it was destroyed on, in their masses, leaving flowers, praying there, the clergy as well as laity. It shows that there is still solidarity. There is still an Orthodox Christian community alive and well, perhaps in this semi catacomb type state. So I think this is like a really positive message. Just want to briefly mention Bishop Gideon on that same show with Andrea Afanasiev on Spas TV. He anathematized the Ukrainian government again. Openly, he says anathema to all these people who organized and orchestrated and let this event take place, who greenlit this destruction of this church. And more conspiratorially speaking, whether these trucks take all the debris from the church. Again, a mystery. Is it some pit outside of Kiev? Will they be desecrated elsewhere? We don't know. And the fact that we don't know and the fact that we don't trust the Zelensky Ukrainian regime to even put these pieces of the church somewhere in to be reused perhaps or reutilized for some other construction and simply they'd be dumped somewhere, perhaps desecrated, maybe even thrown into a sewer somewhere. We know throughout Christian history what people of this sort of Talmudic mindset do to former church sites. We spoke about it with Anthony of Westgate a few times. It's not pretty. Desecrating holy sites is a profession of theirs. I don't think the pieces of this church, especially from the altar, were taken and just dumped into some unknown site. I think things were done to them, but perhaps we'll find out more when Kiev is finally liberated. This sort of talk about Putin's peace treaty. The church persecution would need to be a point on that alleged so-called peace treaty because it's simply still going and it's not stopping.
We briefly mentioned it on our show, even more briefly than you guys did, because it was literally happening that night or had taken place. If anybody has ever seen Ukrainian Orthodox parishioners and the kind of humiliation and violence that they endure in piety and in patience on camera, it's no surprise considering what the Orthodox journalists that you interviewed and that said on the show. Yeah, that checks out. They are like that. They endure, and you're right. That probably indicates, probably to the chagrin of the Kiev administration, that there are still there is still this silent minority, maybe it might even turn into a majority later, who want to be liberated and who want to see the two churches together again, and to eventually, of course, get rid of the schismatic church. And of course, it's very sad. The truth is, many people have been killed because of their faith in Ukraine long before the SMO. The thing that Patriarch Bartholomew signed on to with this fake, non-canonical Ukrainian, the other Ukrainian Orthodox Church, it's not surprising that nobody goes to it, that it's empty, because all it does is, in a way that is its only function, is to just drive real Christians out of their temples, out of their homes. But it won't change anything. They'll eventually win. They will endure this.
I think that's the general message of the entire 2 year plus period at this point, and even Syrian Orthodox Christians and Serbian Orthodox Christians in the 1990s would
Yeah,
stand in solidarity. So we pray for all those persecuted. And it's been a really good show. Lots of big stories that we covered today.
yeah,
GSP,
yeah.
I appreciate yourself and your professional
I'm always
opinion on.
honored to be on your show.
It's been great. Hopefully, we will have more collaborations in the future because, again, there's a lot to discuss, and it looks like the stories are not slowing down. I'll be honest, week to week, it looks like there's almost not a slow week in sight, and I think it's
I
quite
know.
fascinating. But GSP, where can our listeners who aren't familiar with your work, where can they find your show? Perhaps give us some shout outs here.
So I'm the co-host of the War Report, which is on Constantine Martelli's channel on YouTube. You can also find Constantine Martelli on Twitter as well. So we try to do about a show a week, and we'll be recording tomorrow, actually. Constantine and I are both Orthodox Christians. He's a convert, I'm cradle, but that doesn't matter. If anything, Constantine's conversion has been a blessing to me to take my own faith more seriously. Yeah, you can find us there. The account is Constantine Martelli. So that's CONSTANTINE, and then Martelli, MARTELI. And yeah, so we have the War Report. We've been going at this for a few years now.
That's amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Hopefully, we can collaborate more on your channel and you guys can come to our show as well. I think we'll keep the
Yeah, we'd
relationship
love
open.
to.
And of course, guys, thank you for listening to this episode. We appreciate your support. Again, follow us on our Substack, which is worldwarnow.co. That is just a website. If you type that into your browser, worldwarnow.co, that is C for cat, O for orange, it'll come up. And again, probably the arc of information and the place you really should follow if you have the Telegram app is Telegram/World War Now, Tele. And that is the place where we will always be found. World War Now _ on X. Twitter is a good place to follow. Follow Gnomerad on Twitter as well. He is the main host. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it today for the episode, so it's myself and GSP breaking down this week's news for you. Really good episodes to come. Stay tuned. Thank you for your support. Have a good week.
Thank you. Take care.